If you are trying to build the best DFS lineup for week 6, you are in the right place, because we are going to cover everything you need to know for this week, so let's get into it. And we'll begin at the running back position, where we'll look at the Chargers running back Kyren Williams, who has one of the best roles in football, but last week in a difficult matchup against the Eagles, he scored only 7 points. But now everything has changed because he's a 7-point favorite against the Cardinals' bottom 5 run defense. And that defense allows the 4th most receptions to running backs, which fits perfectly with Kyren Williams, who leads all running backs in routes run, and he has the 3rd most targets amongst backs this year. So he's a great play, and so is this next receiver. And he's a great play every single week, but that would be Devontae Adams at $8,100, and this is a squeaky wheel narrative after he only got 4 targets against his former team, the Packers, and he seemed frustrated. But now he faces a Patriots secondary that has a ton of injuries and has looked worse by the week. So far this season, Adams ranks 1st in red zone usage and 4th in wide receiver efficiency. So play Adams, and then the first stack that you should consider for this week is the Jacksonville Jaguars. Trevor Lawrence at just $6,500. He has the 6th highest team total on the slate at 25.5 points this week, and here's the deal. He'll face a beatable Colts secondary that he beat in week 1, where multiple of his receivers from Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones that week had solid games. I'll be looking to stack up Ridley and Christian Kirk this week, depending on what happens with Zay Jones' injury status. And let's talk about Christian Kirk, because he's still dirt cheap. He's only $5,400, despite this year producing very high numbers, especially when Zay Jones has been out, and Jones is questionable this week. Last week we saw Zay Jones leave the game early, and it led to yet again Christian Kirk playing a lot. 96% of the routes led to 8 targets, another solid performance of 14.5 fantasy points. And now so far this season, if you look at the 4 games where Zay Jones has not played or has played and then left with injury, weeks 2 through weeks 5, you've seen 92% of the routes run for Christian Kirk, and he's earned a very strong 28% of the targets. That's more than Ridley. So he's somebody you want to play against the Colts zone defense that he could honestly dominate out of the slot. Another strong wide receiver trending to play is Amon-Ra St. Brown, and honestly, he produces and performs like an $8,000 receiver, but he's only $7,700 here in a solid matchup against the Tampa Bay Bucks. In 4 games this season, he has averaged 8.5 targets per game and 17.5 fantasy points, and in 2 of those games, he was playing hurt. So Amon-Ra is a solid play at lower ownership, and here's the deal. There's 70% of people who watch these videos who are not subscribed. If you are one of those people, be sure to hit the subscribe button so you can see my future content. Now we slide to the running back position, where kind of like Christian Kirk being so cheap, surprisingly, I'm surprised that Joe Mixon at just $6,300, he's like the 10th or 11th highest priced running back, is this cheap. He's coming off of a week where he saw 29 opportunities, and even though he hasn't been all that efficient, the Bengals aren't using any other backs. Over the last 3 games, Mixon has played 77% of the snaps and handled 86% of the running back opportunities. This is one of, if not the best roles in football right now. And here's the deal. He has an impressive 97 touches through 5 games, but just 1 touchdown. Expect that to change. Another running back seeing fantastic usage, especially the past couple of weeks like Joe Mixon, is Travis Etienne at $7,100, but his ownership, according to the DFS Blueprint on Patreon, is coming in a little bit higher. And now this makes sense because he was the #1 overall scoring running back last week, and this was on the London slate in the morning, so it wasn't on the main slate, but he still did that for a lot of people in their fantasy leagues, and they recognize what he did. And over the last 2 weeks, 84% of the snaps and 73% of the rush attempts is a strong role. That has led to 27 opportunities over the last 2 games on average, and now he has a strong matchup against the Colts where he could pick up easily like 4 or 5 catches in this game. Before we head to what could be one of the better stacks on the slate, let's talk about one more elite running back, and that is $6,800 Alvin Kamara, who through 2 games now, he has averaged 25 opportunities. And last week, his snaps dipped to only 63%. I say only, that's still a strong number, but it's because he lost snaps in the 4th quarter during garbage time. He would have played 70% of the snaps again. And heading into his 3rd game on the year, he has one of the best matchups you can find against the Houston Texans, who rank 31st against the run. All right, now let's get into that quarterback who I would say is definitely a top 3 stack this week, if not the best stacking option. And it's going to be Matthew Stafford and the Rams against the Cardinals. Look, Stafford is really affordable at $6,100, and he has 2 clear stacking options with Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, both earning 30% of the targets last week. And this Rams team comes into the week with the 4th highest team total at 27.75 points. It's actually the 2nd highest team total on this main slate for DraftKings, behind only the Miami Dolphins. Stafford is going to face the Cardinals' 30th ranked secondary that just let an injured Joe Burrow throw for 320 plus yards last week. So you know the 2 main wide receiver stacking pieces, but Tyler Higbee, if you want another cheaper option for your stack, is $4,000, and the flat price principle, like we talk about in my DFS course, it's naturally going to lead to lower ownership compared to other guys priced around him. Expect other guys like Zach Ertz, maybe Dalton Schultz, and definitely Evan Ingram to come in higher owned. The flat price principle says that, hey, at $4,000 flat, people are just going to look a little bit better thinking they're getting a better value, or if they spend an extra $100 or $200, they'll think they're getting a better player. At a flat price, just psychology-wise with human pricing passing in numbers, they don't think it's as good. So Higbee's a nice cheap option, mostly just for stacks. And look, $5,300 Marquise Brown, I am shocked. Him and Christian Kirk should not be this cheap, especially Marquise Brown, who look, over the last 2 weeks, Arizona has had to pass more because they've been trailing, and he's averaged 10 targets in these games. But it hasn't just been the past 2 weeks where he's been productive. You can follow me on Twitter and look at this tweet that I posted here. Over the last 4 games, he's been seeing 10 targets, 7, 10, and 10, and in all those games has at least 16 fantasy points. And now with James Conner on IR and missing, their run game's not going to be as efficient. Expect more passing volume for him against the 29th ranked or 31st ranked Rams secondary. This is a good spot. It's also an interesting strategy and game theory spot this week for Garrett Wilson, who's $6,000. There's a couple of things that go into this. The flat price principle here at just $6,000 flat, and also he let a lot of people down last week in a good matchup against Denver, so he's probably not going to pick up any ownership now against the Eagles. And look, Wilson has seen good volume, 7 or more targets in 4 straight games, and he comes into this matchup against the Eagles where you can beat them through the air this season. But the issue is that only 63% of his targets have been catchable, ranking 81st in the NFL. Zach Wilson is actually throwing him the ball more and giving him more chances in man coverage one-on-one downfield, but Wilson has not been accurate. And the Eagles have a fantastic defensive line, so is there going to be time for Zach Wilson to throw? This is a really good game theory if Zach Wilson gets some time to throw to play Garrett Wilson. Now let's move to the Buccaneers wide receiver Mike Evans, who injured his hamstring before the bye week, and then the bye week came, so he's had a couple weeks to heal this, and kind of people are forgetting about how good he's been this season. But Evans has played 3 fully healthy games and has earned 10, 8, and 10 targets. That's solid. In the fantasy production, 18.5, 29, and 17 points. He's managed to rank top 5 in wide receiver efficiency this season, despite being 30 years old, and now he's not coming in with much ownership. And neither is his teammate Chris Godwin. Now, if Mike Evans gets ruled out for this game with this hamstring injury, I expect Godwin's ownership at just $6,900 to come up a little bit. It is not the easiest matchup. The Lions right now have a top 10 secondary through the first 5 weeks of the season, but here's why you want Godwin. We saw him earn a season high 11 targets in the last game, running 35 routes, which led the team, and he put up his first 100-yard game with Mike Evans leaving early. And a big part of his success and Evans this year is Baker Mayfield, who's in 3 out of 4 games this year has looked really good, completing 70% of his passes. Very quietly this season, Godwin has earned 25% of the team's targets, which is a strong to elite number. And look at this. He has 7 red zone targets through just 4 games, but doesn't have a touchdown yet. Expect that to change if this volume keeps up. So let's go from the Bucs wide receivers now to an interesting quarterback. And if you have the fantasy blueprint, you would have been on Joe Burrow's big game last week with Jamar Chase, and you probably would have won a good amount of money, like one of our patrons who won over $40,000 last week. And I'm going back to the well with Joe Burrow at $6,400 here. The matchup against Seattle is solid, and both teams have over a 21-point team total, so we could see a sneaky shootout. Burrow looked a lot healthier last week. He even scrambled for his longest scramble of 10+ yards on the season, and he threw 46 times without an issue. The obvious stacking options are Jamar Chase, T. Higgins if he plays, but I also want to go back to Tyler Boyd. Look, I know he let a lot of people down, but he had 7 targets, 6 catches, and he had a 15-yard touchdown called back by a bad penalty in this game. You did not have to double stack Burrow last week because Jamar Chase went for 50+ points, but generally speaking, most weeks and this week, I want 2 guys in those stacks with the not-so-mobile Joe Burrow. And one of those guys that we kind of mentioned would be T. Higgins if he returns this week. They have a bye week next week. He's dealing with some fractured/broken ribs, so I don't think he's going to play, but they're holding out hope that he's day-to-day and could play. Just for what it's worth, in 3 healthy games this year, he is averaging 9.3 targets a game. So there's an interesting stack for you this week that's picking up some buzz, but really not a lot, and that's surprising based on what Burrow did last week. Now let's move back to the running back position. And this running back will probably be the highest owned, should be the highest owned on the week because he's only $6,400. There's no Devon Achane, and that would be Raheem Mostert, who within 2 games this year without Devon Achane is averaging 19 fantasy points and 15.5 touches per game. Now the fact that he's going to be the highest owned guy in the DFS blueprint, that's fine. You can still play the best plays on the slate as long as you build a positive lineup around them. And check out how good Mostert has been this year. He ranks 5th in yards per touch, 2nd in broken tackles, and 4th in fantasy points. And this week he'll face the Carolina Panthers run defense that ranks 29th in the NFL. He's a 2-touchdown favorite, 13.5 to 14 points. That's great for starting running backs, and the Panthers allow the 2nd most points to the position. Jeff Wilson could return this week, and I would expect him to be involved and score right around 10 or more fantasy points, which is good for him as well, but Mostert still profiles out as the RB1. Now, before we get into a sleeper running back that you need to know about and potentially play this week, I want to let you know about the DFS blueprint. You can see all the tools you get every single day of the week. Our Sunday morning Patreon exclusive podcast where I talk about the best leverages on the plate, the guys that you need to be playing, like those Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase stacks at low ownership last week, game by game matchup notes, the overall blueprint with ownership, projection, drinkings, and a whole lot more. This is just a part of what you get in the blueprint. And here's a sneak peek as part of the projections and ownership and value. Here's my best value wide receivers as of this recording for week 6. You can see sorted by value with their ownership next to them. Josh Downs, Robert Woods, we talked about Christian Kirk and Marquise Brown in this one, but also Jamar Chase, despite being a high price, still a top 5 value this week. That's how good he projects out. Now, to access the DFS blueprint, it is simple. You just scan the QR code on the screen or click the link in the description below to join the thousands of others who are currently using it. So as promised, here is that lower owned, the running back who's not picking up a lot of ownership, and it's $6,700 Kenneth Walker, and it makes sense because he's priced right around Raheem Mostert, who's going to pick up the most ownership, and then guys above him who are seeing elite roles in production lately, like Alvin Kamara and Travis Etienne, are soaking all the ownership away from Kenneth Walker, who's coming off the bye week. But Walker has seen a good role himself. Look at this on the season. Week 4 before the bye, he plays 71% of the snaps, handles 74% of the rush attempts. This has now been the third game out of 4 games this year where he's handled at least 70% of the rush attempts, a strong role. And this is translated to 18 touches a game, and he's 7th best in fantasy points per game, but since he went on the bye week, we're all forgetting about him. Now, the knock on him in the past was that he's not as efficient, but so far this year, he's been efficient. Top 20 in yards per touch, and he's broken the 4th most tackles. So I think Kenneth Walker is one of the best leverage plays on the slate at any position. Now let's get into a wide receiver picking up a little bit too much ownership. And that would be the rookie in Minnesota, Jordan Addison, who without Justin Jefferson, yes, at this $5,700 price tag, it makes him really appealing, but once the ownership starts seeing 15% or more, it starts to drain it down a little bit, the overall upside of the play. But we saw it last week, and this is why people are excited. An 18.5 fantasy point day when Justin Jefferson left. This was a season high 9 targets. He played basically all the starter snaps and ran the most routes he's ran all season once Justin Jefferson left. So if you could play him in a unique way, maybe you're running a Minnesota stack, maybe you skinny stack him with a lower owned option on his opponent's team this week, I think that's somewhat interesting. Now, another interesting play this week is probably, if it's not Matthew Stafford, probably Tua in the Miami Dolphins stack, which every single week they've been great. Last week, you really couldn't go any wrong. Either went with Joe Burrow in the Jamar Chase stacks, or you went with Tua in the Tyreek stacks from the DFS Blueprint podcast. And either way, it basically worked out for you with those wide receivers and quarterbacks having big days. Now, yet again this week, the Miami Dolphins have the highest team total on the slate, 31 points. It's almost 4 more points higher than any other team on this slate. And we can just keep relying on them to build explosive plays. But can we rely on the Panthers to keep it close as 13.5 point underdogs on the other side? That's the big question. This Panthers secondary ranks 20th in the NFL, and they are bottom 5 in tackling, which is not something that you want to be bad at when you're facing this Miami team in open space. Now, Tyreek Hill is an obvious stacking piece, and the other stacking piece is the guy who continues to be a leverage for this team in Jalen Waddle. And Jalen Waddle is interesting to me, but here's the deal. He's $7,600. He's not cheap. If he was $6,800, it's a little bit easier here, but he is highly expensive for not being as prioritized in this offense. Now, that said, in his second game back from injury last week, we saw a lot of good things out of him. A 36% target share is fantastic. His routes went from 76% to 88% last week. This landed on 10 targets, but only 35 yards. He wasn't targeted much downfield. A touchdown basically saved his day, an early touchdown. When he has 35 yards and Tyreek's going for 180 plus, yeah, it doesn't look great. So Waddle is the ultimate leverage play because he is expensive. It's really hard to get to that price point and justify it when there's other guys around him. I mean, heck, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Devontae Adams, pretty similar prices. But that said, if this was the week where Jalen Waddle goes for multiple touchdowns or 100 plus yards, no one's going to be on. Now, a player that nobody will be on is Tyler Lockett because he's coming off of the bye week, and look at this. He's priced $5,700, the exact same price as Jordan Addison, where most people are going to go to because of the recency bias that Justin Jefferson is out. Addison seeing 9 targets in a good game last week, but I prefer Tyler Lockett here at lower ownership in a good matchup against a bottom 10 Cincinnati Bengals secondary. And for what it's worth, lower ownership on Tyler Lockett, even though he's been solid this year. Now, he only has 1 point over 10 games, but he's still earning 24% of the targets, which is strong. And speaking of strong recent performances, $3,400 for Jonnu Smith is still good. And believe it or not, he leads all tight ends, every tight end in the league, in receiving yards the past 2 weeks, and he's earned a target on 25% of his routes. That ranks top 5 in the NFL. So he has some upside in this offense, even though they don't pass it a lot. If they pass 30 to 35 times, Jonnu Smith is getting targets from Desmond Ridder in the middle of the field and staying on the field in the red zone. Now, a running back that we have to call out, and it seems like he'll probably miss this game, is the Bears rookie running back Roschon Johnson at $4,600. Most guys who get a concussion miss the next week, but he played on Thursday Night Football the week before, so he has an extra couple of days here. But Khalil Herbert is out, which means Roschon's going to see more usage. And so far this season, he's worked well ahead of the veteran Deontay Foreman, who's been behind him. He played more snaps than him in week 1, and then Foreman just hasn't even been active the last couple of weeks. And this season, Roschon ranks 18th in yards per touch, averaging 5 yards per touch. So this is great. If he starts earning more touches now, that efficiency, if it stays somewhat high, will lead to big games. Now, if Roschon doesn't end up playing, yeah, Deontay Foreman has to be on your radars because there would be no Roschon and no Herbert, and then he would be the main workhorse back. Speaking of workhorse backs, Josh Jacobs checks in at $7,000 flat, and the flat price principle is working in our favor again. Now, he is picking up 20% ownership, but it probably should be closer to 30% ownership, but you have guys like Alvin Kamara around him, you have guys like Travis Etienne around him. I would prefer, if you're looking for leverage, Kenneth Walker here, but Josh Jacobs is probably the best overall play in this price range because there's no questions about his role. So far this season, as you can see here on the bottom, he's played 79% of the snaps and handled 75% of the opportunities, and this usage has increased, as you saw last week against the Packers, 86% of the snaps. And very quietly, he's earned 5 or more targets in 4 straight games, which just gives him an even better floor and a ceiling, especially when he's playing behind a not so great offensive line. And now he's going to be a 3-point favorite against the Patriots, who have allowed 30 plus points in 2 straight games. A wide receiver in the $6,000 range that I think is not going to come in all that highly owned is going to be Michael Pittman, because he hasn't had a great week now in about 3 weeks, but this past week things were encouraging. His usage went back to being elite. He ran 100% of the routes and earned 29% of the targets, his most since week 1. And now you're going to have Gardner Minshew starting, who's a more pocket-friendly quarterback, not going to run as much, which should probably help the targets and upside of Pittman. I'm going to bet this week on Pittman getting back to the end zone for the first time since week 1. Now I want to talk about one more tight end, and that's going to be the most expensive tight end. $6,600 TJ Hawkinson, $1,000 more than anybody else, $1,600 more than anybody not named Sam Laporta, and it makes sense because there's no Justin Jefferson, and this is the target leader at the tight end position with 39 targets and 30 catches, leads the NFL. Makes sense that he's this highly priced. I think he's still a fine play. So this is everything that you need to know for this week. Some of the best plays, some of the best leverage plays, and basically what's going to set you up to build the best lineup. Now, if you want access to even more tools and analysis that will help you win this week, well, join the thousands of others that have access to the DFS blueprint by scanning the QR code on the screen or clicking the link in the description below.